thank you all for joining me or the whole webinar. My name is Lauren Ponisio. I'm an associate professor at the Department of Biology at the University of Oregon, and my specialty is bee community ecology and conservation. So we focus on a variety of different systems, and today I'm going to tell you I snuck in a bit of harvested forests in addition to thinking about fire management. So today we're going to talk about bees, fire, and harvested forests. And I thought, I'm the first person today, so just in case you're just tuning into the webinar and missed the other 2 days, bees, they're amazing. There are about 700 species in Oregon, 600 in Washington, 1,500 to 1,700 in California, about 4,000 in North America. I'm sure there are bees in your other states as well, but in general, the West is a global hotspot for bee diversity, and I'll show a map of that in a moment. There are also what our lab often maybe flippantly calls non-bees, so not bees. So there are a whole variety of pollinators out there that are not bees, including butterflies, beetles, flies, vertebrates even, so bats and hummingbirds. But in general, in temperate systems, like in, the United States, the most abundant and most effective pollinators will always be bees. And just so we all are on the same page of what bees are, this is the phylogenetic tree of Hymenoptera, so the order of bees, wasps, and ants. And bees are down here, so they're vegan wasps. They've given up the meat-eating lifestyle of their other wasp brethren, and they only consume pollen and nectar. So there's a whole variety of other wasps out there, including wasps that eat pollen, but only bees have really fully gone all in with flowers. And like I mentioned before, the Western US really is a global hotspot for bee diversity. So if you look at the dark colors, so the dark red is where there are the most bees. And unlike a lot of other creatures like vertebrates and, I was going to say vertebrates and birds, but birds are vertebrates, uh, mammals and birds, uh, bees do not peak in diversity in the tropics. They peak in diversity in Mediterranean regions like California, like the actual Mediterranean, like South Africa, Chile, Australia. So when we do conservation in the Western US, we're doing really important conservation globally. And, I'll warn you all that there is a bit of a Western US focus with this talk, but I'll try where I can, I'll try to bring up papers I know of in other places. I do think that with fire and bees and harvested forest and bees, there is a bit of a bias towards the Western US. So why does this matter? We have 8 pollinators in California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho with upcoming listing decisions. Most of them are bumblebees. So the Western bumblebee is something you probably have heard about. It used to be the most common bumblebee in the West, as you would guess by its name, and now its populations have declined precipitously. Of course, the monarch. And so either these bees are petitioned under the Federal Endangered Species Act, listed under the Endangered Species Act. We do have some that are finally listed, or within each specific state being considered for listing at the state level. And what's going on with bees? Generally, bee decline is related to pesticides, inadequate nutrition, and disease. I like this map because it's contrasting where we really need pollination services. So that's in areas, and it is lacking. So the red areas, like the Central Valley, are places with really high pollination demand and really low bee abundance. But you'll also notice that a lot of the US is just this pale blue color, which is we don't have any information about bee populations. So another piece of this is that we just generally lack a lot of understanding of how our bee populations are doing. So, scooching over then, a lot of those areas that were pale blue were forested areas. So we often think of, bee habitat as being something like a beautiful open meadow, but we might ask ourselves, where are bees in forests? And to answer that question, we have to know what bees need. So in general, bees need 2 essential components. The first is nutrition. So they need so they need nutrition, and the second is nesting. So thinking about nutrition, just over and over and over again, when we do bee studies, we know that bee richness, so the number of species of bees and their abundance tracks the abundance and richness of flowers. So if you have lots of flowers, you have lots of bees over and over again. Most adult bees will drink nectar and some pollen to kind of provide their bodies with the energy for flight. And females will provision their nest with pollen and processed nectar. And again, that's the vegan wasp piece of it. Like all they rely on is pollen and nectar. Thinking about nesting, it's a lot more complicated. So we often group bees into two categories. The first are above ground nesters, below ground nesters, and these will excavate these incredible nests underground. Some of them quite deep, and you can see some the little holes they make in the ground, as well as like what those little tunnels look like. And sometimes they put these little turrets. If you look in the right corner, there are these like little, they call them little castle turrets around the nests. Bumblebees will nest in shallow cavities in the ground, sometimes old, rat nests and things like that. There's this beautiful bee right there that is a little osmia that nests like within a couple inches of the ground and lines their nest in petals just because, they like beautiful things, I guess. And then a really important bee, these are bees that are used in alfalfa cultivation. And so alfalfa growers will actually make these bare patches to bring in these gorgeous bees that have these opalescent bands to provide pollination to alfalfa. And then there's a whole nother class of nesters, and these are all above ground nesters. And they just, it seems like anything you can think of, they'll try to nest in it. So above ground cavities, bumblebees like to nest in them. That picture of a tree has little arrows pointing to those holes. Those are probably some kind of leafcutter bee or mason bee that has used an existing hole and stopped it up with mud. There are bees that make like little huts out of tiny little pebbles, which are really lovely. Um, and all sorts of things like crevices, reeds. If it's an above ground thing with a hole in it, they will attempt, to nest in it. And you will also notice that throughout none of this, did you see the picture of a European honeybee? Of course, these are a really important bee to agriculture, but they are highly invasive in the Americas. They were introduced originally by the Pilgrims. Fun fact. They're social. They have a hive and a queen, that kind of classic structure. They do compete with native bees for resources, and really importantly, more and more we're understanding they share their parasites and pathogens with them, and are associated with decline. And this is what their nests look like in the wild. They look really, really neat. The honeycomb will be up in trees, and you'll see them in forests. So where are bees in forests? Where are those important nesting resources? It's this early successional, also called early cirral, post-fire habitat. And you can see this beautiful open meadow. This is in Yosemite National Park. There's, all sorts of above ground materials that bees might nest in. There is also bare patches of ground where those below ground nesters would like. And really importantly, lots and lots of flowers. So you can imagine, going back in time, like we'd have this really patchy landscape. There'd be a meadow. Maybe bees would always be resident there. There'd be a fire. These trees would die, creating open habitat. And, the next year there'd be a fire in another area. And so we'd have this really patchy system where bees would be flying around these open patches, either going above the intact forest or through it, and kind of connecting in this patch-like system. Then thinking about maybe harvested forests, which are very common in the Pacific Northwest, it's a bit of a different system, but through tree cutting, we've kind of removed the pesky canopy like fire does for us. So uh, instead of, maybe, a mix of dead and alive trees, we have these patches of recently cut forests that then all of these beautiful flowers come up in. And so this is looking down at Oregon, and you can see this patchwork of different clear cuts. And so you can imagine bees, just like they would have in those fire systems, moving between these early cirral habitats, finding the resources they need. And then as the trees grow up, they kind of move to the next one. So I'm going to talk to you today about what we know about the different characteristics of fires and of clear cuts or harvested forests that promote bee populations, and particularly with an emphasis on the management. Maybe not so much from the fire side, because more thinking of fire characteristics, but bringing that in general. So we have a big fire. Let's start with, the first moment. So we have a big fire, and what happens kind of in the next year or the season with the bee populations. And We think that the main thing that will determine this is their nesting habit. So if they're below ground nesters, as long as they're nesting pretty deep in the ground, which most of them are, they'll be okay. But the shallow ground nesters are likely going to be, the fire will be a fatal event for them. So they won't be able to survive that type of heat. But luckily, the really deep ground nesters, the soil heat horizon for fire is actually pretty like it doesn't go very deep. And so a lot of those bees will be able to emerge the next year. The above ground nesters, all dead, all dead. So, and there's actually been a study that tested this where they took bee nests and wood and caught them on fire, and indeed, they died. So these guys need to recolonize from other areas. But what about the long-term effects of fire on bees? So not just the instantaneous, what happens when a wildfire moves through an area. We know some things. So there have been many studies about just fire versus no fire. And these have been all across the US and all across the globe. And so I'll cover those results. There have been some studies on the effects of fire severity. So and I'll go into the definition of that later. There have been some studies on the effects of pyrodiversity or the diversity of fire patterns in an area. And there has been one study and maybe a few other that are a little less larger scale on the effects of salvage logging, so post-fire logging on bee communities. So starting with the fire versus no fire. And this has been done through meta-analyses that looked at all of these individual studies and assembled the results. So in general, bees love fire, as we expected. Forests burned by wildfire and prescribed birds have higher abundance, though not necessarily richness. So this is a figure from one of those meta-analyses. And you can see the abundance effect size, so in the blue little tabs, is higher than 0, whereas richness, though generally higher, there's a lot of variability. So we at least know that fire tends to affect abundance. And this is a really interesting study done where they actually put bumblebees out in different levels of canopy closure. So they put out these adorable little nest boxes with bumblebees in them. And they found that really clearly as the forest canopy closes, those bumblebees stop being able to survive in those areas. And then when you're in intact forest, there will be complete nest failure of these bumblebees. So we really need some open canopy created by fire for these bees to survive. So moving on to thinking about fire severity. And so fire severity is kind of like fire intensity is the heat and the intensity of the fire. Severity is the change in biomass and disturbance to the soil and plants afterwards. And so I like to start with a high severity fire. So that's in the west, that's 90% or more tree mortality. On the east, a lot of times your forest actually can still survive that, but in general, you have either it's called a stand replacing fire or a canopy fire where you have a really solid amount of loss of trees. Moderate is a bit more of a mix. Some trees die, some trees live, but it's still, a good solid disturbance. Whereas a low severity fire would be more like a brush fire moving through the understory. You have some tree mortality, but in general, like a lot of your trees survived that. And so historically in the West, we had about 5% high severity, like 5% of all of our fires are mixed severity, but only about 5% of that was high severity. I think there are similar numbers in different parts of the country. And so this is just a beautiful picture of a high severity fire. This is actually the photo that got me interested in studying the effects of fire on bees because, as you guys will notice, there's just a lot of bee food in that picture. Um, this is a beautiful like sea of ceanothus and the Sierras, lots of great resources for bees, beautiful seas of lupin. Lupin and other nitrogen fixers tend to like to move in after high severity fires. And so you have just all of these resources. An interesting important note is that one little kind of like caveat with high severity fire is that when a tree burns at that temperature, the phloem actually kind of like crystallizes. And so even though it looks like there's lots of above ground trees for bees to make nests in, sometimes that can not be the case. You do need a bit of a mix. This like completely, burned tree would actually not be great bee habitat, but as long as there's something in the area that didn't burn at that temperature, then there'll probably be enough above ground resources. So thinking about severity in general, bees love high severity fire. So in the Oregon Coast Range, there were 20 times more individuals and 11 times more bee species when you compare high versus low severity patches. We saw there was a really similar thing seen in Montana, and not quite as impressive, but in the Sierra Nevadas, we found 3 times as many floral species and twice as many bee species in high versus low. Um, and one question though is what happens as that kind of historic range of high severity fire changes and we're getting these really, really huge high severity patches. So this is a severity map of the Holiday Farm Fire, which is just outside of Eugene, very, very, very close to Eugene. And you can see these like enormous patches of red that are like kilometers across. And um, this is not what we saw as historical levels of high severity. So this is 24% high severity fire versus the normal level of 5. And so we don't really know, as mentioning that like you need some places for the bees to survive the fire itself. And in addition, we need some mixture of resources, like some moderate severity, some low severity for those above ground nesters. We don't know if these high severity fires will have that positive effect we saw in the more like historically natural levels. So that's something our team is going out to test. So to kind of like look at what that looks like, can we think of these high severity patches like islands? So we have this big like, you know, island we have to colonize from the exterior. So you have these little bees, out in the exterior. They survive the fire, or they emerge from nests that survive the fire, and they need to get to the center of that high severity patch. And you can imagine some just don't have the flight capacity. They stick around the edges. Maybe a really large bee, like a bumblebee, could fly all the way into that center of that fire, and others are just not interested. So that's something we're testing. Here's our wonderful field crew out in 2020, and this is led by my grad student, Rebecca Hayes. And so we'll be able to answer that question, I think, in about a year or so. We have all the data collected. So moving on uh, from biodiversity, moving on to biodiversity. So biodiversity, what is it? It's fire diversity, and so it's what creates this gorgeous patchy landscape in the Sierras. So it's fire season, it's fire severity, it's fire frequency, it's all of those pieces of fire coming together to create this habitat heterogeneity. And in general, we find that fire diversity or biodiversity is great. So flowering plant, bee, and interaction richness and community resistance, so the ability to withstand a disturbance, increases with increasing biodiversity. And on the side, we found that with every 5% increase in the diversity of fires in an area, we gained 1 plant, 1 bee, and 2 unique interactions. So kind of a cool result. Another paper found that this fire diversity also increases bee nutrition. So they looked at those bumblebee colony, like I think it was they put out bees. I forgot whether they were bumblebees or mason bees, and they actually looked at their nutrition, and they found that with every increase in fire diversity, these bees had more nutrition. And then in combination with the ability to kind of shift their diets, when we had a really huge drought in California, the bees in more biodiverse areas were better able to buffer against that and still find the flowers they needed to survive. So it's kind of thinking about like the portfolio effect. Like when we have all this diversity in a place and you have a really big disturbance, you're able to make it through that disturbance. So lastly, let's talk about salvage logging. So there haven't been many studies that have controlled for other fire factors, but the one that has found that salvage logging isn't great. There are 4 times fewer species, though interestingly, abundance was unaffected. So there was still a similar abundance of bees, but there were way fewer species. And the thought is that we're losing our above ground nesters, right? When you remove all the above ground material from an area, we're going to lose that big clade of bees, like the two pictured with their nests, either in the trees themselves or in reeds that would have nested in that area, but there's nothing for them. So here's a summary of the long-term effects of wildfire on bees. So thinking about fire versus no fire, just in general, fire increases bee abundance, often richness, but with a lot higher variability. With severity, high severity fire increases bee richness and abundance. Bees really like high severity burns when comparing it to unburned areas or low severity burns. Uh, this is unclear, however, whether this effect will change as the size of those high severity patches has gotten really, really, really large. And I'll also mention on that point that in studies in birds, they have found that effect where uh, we don't see really high bird diversity in the center of those high severity patches. So we might see something similar with bees. In terms of biodiversity, fire increases bee richness and abundance, nutrition, and resistance to drought. Biodiversity does. And in terms of salvage logging, we see that decreases in bee richness, but not necessarily abundance. And just as a caveat, this really has only been one study, so we need future work, further work on that. So moving on from thinking about fire to thinking about, a fire-like disturbance, i.e., clear cutting or harvesting trees in an area. So when we think of the effects of tree harvest on bees, we can look at the years post-harvest. So how many years since all the trees were removed. We can think about adding floral enhancements to these areas that are not usually necessary in a fire system because flowers come back by themselves, but in something like a harvested forest where herbicide is applied, maybe we need some floral enhancements. We can think about tree thinning, so ways to keep the canopy open longer. And we can think about the effects of herbicide use intensity on these areas. And all of these have very few studies, with maybe the exception of years post-harvest. There's a mounting number of studies, maybe still less than 10, but with some replication, both in maybe primarily in the West, but more and more in Georgia and other really major timber growing regions. But for the rest, I think there's like one or two studies in each. So focusing in on years post-harvest, we see that in 1 to 6 years post-harvest, in the Oregon Coast Range, which is an exceptionally wet and productive system, we have really good bee and flower diversity. There's a peak around year 3, so it kind of like goes up and then down. So you can imagine, first there's clear cut, year 1, a lot of disturbance. Then you start seeing recruitment of little forbs and maybe some shrubs and things that survived the cutting. The tree saplings are small enough where they're not crowding anything out. And then eventually, it turns back into closed canopy forest. There are some flowers in closed canopy forest, of course, but we really don't, if you think of walking through a closed canopy coniferous forest in the West, it's pretty quiet. So we don't really see a lot of bees in those areas. This may be different in places that are drier. For example, even just the Oregon Cascade Range. So it's a more inland range, so it doesn't get as much water, so much moisture off the ocean. We might expect this, time period in which the forest is a good place for bees to be longer. The Sierra, similarly, it just takes longer for the trees to grow. I'm not really, more and more studies are coming out of the east. Of course, those forests tend to be more open generally, so this may mean those forests are better longer for bees. Thinking about floral enhancements. So this is a picture out in Oregon. This is a post-fire and post-logging system. And one thing you'll notice is, there's not many flowers. And part of that is with this history of logging, there's like harvest, then usually an herbicide application, followed by, 30 years later, harvest again. We've lost a lot of our native seed bank. And so the idea is maybe if we add this back to the system, sort of like this, if we build it, they will come, we'll sort of see bees showing up because everything else about this place is fantastic for bees, right? Like all these pesky trees are gone. So thinking about that, we wanted to ask, what is the most efficient place within Stance to plant wildflowers? What has the highest germination, growth, and flower production? And do wildflowers persist after being seeded, or they sort of just grow and then die out the next year? And this is something we did with the team, my lab, over in the right. My collaborator, Katie Moriarty from NCASI, the National Council for Air and Stream Improvement, and they're kind of like the research branch of the timber industry. And Rose McDonald is leading this, my grad student. And we were particularly interested in, should we plant into burn/piles? So this is a common practice where the residue left after harvest is lit on fire. We get we got to watch some of them get lit on fire. It was really fun. And this, it really clears out the seed banks. All those invasive grasses and nastiness just kind of get nuked. Versus planting just directly into the clear cut, just directly into the stand. So our method was, we had a bin, we had some vermiculite, we had our seeds all weighed out, to plant exactly the same number in every place. We mix it all together and we planted little plots. Eventually, we just it's called Johnny apple seeding. We would just scatter the seeds in these different areas. And so we wanted to contrast the clear cuts and the burn slash piles. In general, they have been extremely successful. The number of bees we've seen and the amount of flowers has just been incredible. And you'll be walking through the stand and it'll be quiet, and you'll step into one of these enhancements, and it's just, you can hear everything buzzing around. And so in general, we found really high germination, growth, and flower production of the majority of the species trialed. We chose seeds based on what was found in early cereal habitats and prairies in the region, and was also commercially available. We found it was much more efficient to plant in burn slash piles. Like, you would need 10 times the amount of area in the clear cuts to achieve the same number of plants, blooms, and cover. And just generally, it's, there was a lot of other stuff that got into the stands themselves before we did. Whereas if you plant into those burn slash piles right after they finish burning, there's nothing. And so our plants could really take hold and then flourish. And so far, we've surveyed for 3 years and they've persisted just fine. So we did see a little dip in the annuals, which is very common. We seeded at a higher rate than they could naturally reproduce. But in general, kind of after that, we've seen really pretty stable numbers of plants and stable numbers of flowers. Of course, eventually the canopy will close, but hopefully we'll just be able to keep on sampling until we see that happen. Uh, this also led to another project thinking at a much larger scale, and we did a before-after control impact experiment where we are thinking about, can we actually boost bee populations only seeding in these burn slash piles? Like, compared to the area of stand out there, it's small. So is this just kind of bringing the bees that are already there into one place so we can see them, or is this actually bolstering their populations? And so we did this, we're going to do it. We're currently doing a study where we have varying distances between these enhancements across a really large landscape, particularly in the holiday farm fire. And we're going to understand the dynamics of these bees and also screen them for parasites to make sure they're healthy. And we're working on 2 industrial private timber owners and 1 smaller scale owner to have really high replication across this area. And this work is funded by the USDA NIFA. So they're supporting this work as, timber being part of our kind of broader agricultural and system. So moving on from floral enhancements, we can think about thinning. So thinning is this idea that, maybe by removing some of those trees kind of midway through their growth phase, we can keep that canopy open for longer and then have more flowers more consistently and more bees for a longer period of time. And this work was done in collaboration with the Siuslaw National Forest. And they do a lot of thinning treatments these days, as well as, again, Katie Moriarty with Cassie, and led by my grad student, Jesse Van Brown. So we want to know, does thinning reduce canopy? One would say, guess it would, and therefore promote flower and bee abundance and diversity. And generally we found that it does. So if you compare the green bars, those are the thin stands, and we bin them into 2 different age classes. So kind of like mediumly young trees. These are all about 15. They get them around year 15, but it can be later. It can be, even year 20 or so. So those bars are kind of intermediate to the yellow. So the yellow are recently cut stands, like only tiny little saplings, and much higher than the mature stands in purple. And this is bee abundance on the bottom and flowering plant abundance on the top. And we see something really, really similar for diversity, both of flowering plants and of bees. So thinning, as we'd expect, is kind of intermediate between those 2 classes. And lastly, there have been one really important study about the effects of herbicide use on on bee diversity. And so what this study did, and it was in collaboration with the timber industry, was really amazing. They had four treatments. The first, a control, so no herbicide application whatsoever. The second, a light treatment. The third, a moderate, and this is like the light and the moderate are where the industry usually is. And the last, an extremely intensive treatment. And this was done in the Oregon Coast Range, again, a really major timber production area and replicated across the state, just amazing. And they found this was called the intensive forage management study, and it's come up in a bunch. They've looked at not just bees, they looked at birds, they looked at beetles, they looked at spiders, they looked at everything. It was an incredible study. But in terms of bees, increasing levels of herbicide application resulted in fewer flowering plant species and flowers than the non-herbicide control. And that kind of followed that bee richness declined at similar rates as the plants, though abundance, interestingly, was not strongly impacted. So you see that the on the left, we have the richness figure. You can see that those green control lines are much higher than the intensive and the moderate, whereas the abundance is a lot more variable. And actually, some of those you can see by the error bars on that red line that some of those stands that had an intensive herbicide had actually quite a lot of bees. So um, it kind of has a similar feeling to the salvage logging study where when we have a really intensive management treatment, we tend to lose bee species, but maybe not necessarily abundance. So summarizing the effects of tree harvest on bees, we find that there are lots of bees in clear cuts. They are a wonderful place for bees. There is a steep decline in bee abundance and diversity with years post harvest. Um, so we see that peaks somewhere kind of not right at the beginning, but somewhere mid, and that will likely depend on the moisture in the area and how fast those trees grow. We need more studies from different states, though. We need to understand like when those peaks are. In terms of floral enhancements, we find that if adding flowers to a system increases floral abundance and richness. And TBD, in the next couple of years, we'll be publishing the results of our study determining whether this affects the bee populations at large scales. In terms of herbicide, we found a decline, or not we, but this really amazing study found a decline in bee richness, but not necessarily abundance. And I forgot thinning here, but thinning, as we would expect, reduces forest canopy, enabling bees and flowers to survive in those places for longer. And with that, I'd like to thank my amazing lab, who were kind of the boots on the ground people who have done a lot of this work, particularly funding from the USDA NIFA and the National Council for Air and Stream Improvement. So that research branch of the timber industry has been extremely supportive and wonderful, letting us work in their land and teaching us all about the way that timber is grown in the region. And we hope to continue finding new interesting ways to when I moved to Oregon, one of the first things I saw were all the harvested forest, and I was just like, this is going to be an amazing place for bees, and they have been super supportive of us trying to work that out and trying to also make them better. So, thank you so much, and I'm going to put up my summary slide and then take any questions.